This week's budget speech by the Finance Minister has one principal priority, one imagines, and that is to give real direction on how to grow the country's shattered economy, where unemployment is endemic. In many respects, it is now a survival game. I want to look ahead now with Dr Nthabiseng Moleko, who is a development economist at Stellenbosch University. Good afternoon to you and welcome. Let me put this to you that we were in trouble before the pandemic. Things are even worse now. Where does the Minister start on Wednesday?
I think the number one thing, Jeremy, is that we need to very clearly lay out the goal, the vision, and how we will differentiate between the short-term measures and the long-term, long-term development trajectory measures that have different means and mechanisms through which to implement. So let us set the goal to say, what is it that we will do to transform the current growth path that we are on? Quite clearly, an alternative is needed. And I think for us to just simply continue along this trajectory without reviewing some of the outcomes of the now medium-term budget policy statement, but also the economic recovery plan, we should have mechanisms to monitor how far they've moved us, how output has improved, whether employment has positively been affected, and other economic indices that show the economic performance of the country.
And you'll concede when you look at all of those indices, the needle in many respects has hardly moved.
So we've actually seen a regression. The economic output, you look at subsectors, the value add to contribution to GDP as the Stats SA reports on a quarterly basis. You see that even the recovery in the last quarter, the quarter three that we have seen reported, hasn't been adequate. We also see that for the first time since post-World War II, the annual decline of our economic output for the first time has actually been for a full year. So this is the first time we are breaking these barriers in terms of economic recession. So what we are clearly seeing is that the economic the economic growth path and the lackluster growth that we have been locked in has now really shown us that something alternative has to be done, or an alternative has to be put in place. So what we would want to then see is the propelling of household demand, the supply side of the economy moving. We also want to see how revenue generation will occur to improve the fiscal sustainability of the Treasury, of the budget, so that social programs and other expenditure programs of the state can be financed through a growing and inclusive economy. Unless we see subsectors revived and economic subsectors revived, this is not going to change the current growth path.
And the point that you make is that we need a radical rethink as far as the fiscal policy model is concerned. The suggestion is that we are too geared to appeasing the ratings agencies.
So the argument that I make is that the use of fiscal multipliers is imperative in an economic recession. They have been shown to have what we call the marginal propensity to consume has a higher effect in time of recession because households usually don't have savings to dip into, particularly in South Africa where savings rate are at least 14% in terms of to GDP, which is inadequate. So in time of economic recession, what you try to do is have economic stimulus mechanisms to bolster growth, to bolster household aggregate demand, to bolster the supply side of the economy. And this is where the state becomes imperative. But the nature of it all is a short-term measure for mitigation and for bolstering economic activity so that in the long run, you increase your revenue generation capabilities. So you move a little bit back to say, in the short run, if you look at Paul Krugman, who's an economist, world-renowned economist, he argues that the level of debt to GDP that is sustainable is you start to see regressive action after 90% debt to GDP level. But this is argued in economic literature as to what is acceptable. But at that level, what you want to do is to make use of investment or productive investment using any incremental state budget or budget allocation to productive investment, and also to make sure that all your coordination of your state institutions, your Reserve Bank, makes accessible liquidity in the market, makes cheap finance available in the market, releases liquidity so that you boost consumption on the demand side, but also on the supply side, you have the government making sure that they're bolstering using economic policy all the mechanisms that they can use, coordinated fashion, with the same goal to bolster economic activity in the short term. In the long run, you have to have South Africa looking at structural reform where you increase both the primary and the secondary sector contribution as a value add to GDP, because currently the services-led economy hasn't been able to absorb unemployment, deal with inequality, but also even reignite the economic activity that increases exports, business confidence improves, and all the other aspects where we will start to see some of our economic indices picking up, not just from last year's COVID, Jeremy, but from the last 10 years, 20 years. So the economic stabilizers that are built into our economy are not sufficiently doing that. And that's why I talk about fiscal multipliers. And that's why I talk about looking beyond servicing credit rating agencies, but also looking at how we really meet the national development goals, irrespective of what credit rating agencies are saying, because their goal is not the same as the national development goal of employment,
right,
of
but
targeting growth.
You've still got to find a balance between developmental objectives and foreign direct investment, haven't you? The one doesn't always talk
Absolutely.
to the other.
So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an issue of priority. So I think what we have seen in the last 25 years, and we must agree that the priority for the last 25 years has been to bolster FDI. The economic policy, the gear trajectory has been to say what policy imperatives are required so that we can bolster FDI. And we have seen for the last 25 years, whether it's GEAR, ASGISA, every type of development economic plan over the last 25 years has tried to release an increase into FDI with the capital controls, with the exchange policy, with all the type of monetary policy and trade policy that we have seen, the new liberal framework. So the outcome has said that, okay, so far for the last 25 years, these are the outcomes that we have seen. Perhaps with the 17, right now what we are seeing, the World Bank targets at least 25% to GDP coming from FDI. We have not seen this in South Africa. We're stuck between 16 and 18%. And so this says to you that we are unable, regardless of the policy imperatives, to drive FDI up. So the balancing act where I would say is that for now, we need to perhaps look at domestic resource mobilization, alternative raising of capital and finance within our domestic resources to crowd in investment, to match potentially in the long run what the private sector will come in. But the fiscal multiplier and the investment crowding in from a public investment perspective usually comes in with the fiscal multiplier. And this has been shown post-World War economies through Keynesian economics from the US to the Europes to Latin American countries across the world over, and Asian economies as well, that you actually need to use the fiscal multiplier as an economic stabilizer, but also to bolster where you are unable to get the FDI and the private sector investment in. So I think there's possibility there, Jeremy, but I think that right now, what we need immediately is looking at alternative financing where the Reserve Bank can even assist us with cheap finance, with low-cost finance to the government. We do not need to go to multilateral agencies to do this.
Dr. Moleko, thank you very much indeed for outlining all of that, and I look forward to your assessment on this program on Thursday afternoon.